Am I the asshole for announcing my pregnancy first? I am 26 and married to my husband and have an older sister who is 27 who I'll call Kay. For some background, Kay was the golden child, but my parents rapidly changed their tune when she failed university and started a party lifestyle for a bit, no longer the case. Suddenly, I was a favorite because I finished school and had a moderately successful life. I think it's BS that my parents have or had favorites, and I largely keep my distance, but it's something that has bothered Kay a lot. So, my husband and I recently got pregnant, surprise, and though I keep a healthy distance from my parents, we still talk. Boundaries are really important to have with them because they will trample over your entire life and privacy. COVID restrictions are a thing, and I'm not big on parties anyway, so I decided to just tell my family about the latest news during a monthly family video chat last Friday. Once everyone had done the preliminary catching up, my husband and I said we had some news, and then I said I was pregnant. My parents, sisters, and grandmother lost it, screaming and laughing and crying in joy. This is the first grandchild, great-grandchild, niece, or nephew, so they understandably had pretty dramatic reactions. Screaming and laughing and crying in joy. This is the first grandchild, great-grandchild, niece, or nephew, so they understandably had pretty dramatic reactions. Once things calmed down a bit, I asked Kate if she was still there, and she said yes, but she had to go and deal with something else. I thought it was odd, but didn't give it much further thought. Later, I get a text from Kay saying that she was going to make a pregnancy announcement then too, but that I had ruined it. I should have asked her specifically before making the announcement because she, as the firstborn, should have been the one to have the first grandchild, and that my child would get all the attention and love and hers would get second rate. I sent her a text saying that I had no clue she was pregnant and congratulating her, and that I was so sorry she didn't get to make the announcement when she wanted to. I then, possibly quite stupidly, asked her when her due date was, and Kay said, "Don't worry, you're first," and has not answered anything since. So, am I the asshole?
When my mother's new husband called me, he was basically trying to invite me to Christmas, claiming that it would be nice for me to get to know my other siblings. I won't lie, I laughed, and let him know that his children were not my siblings, and that it would be beneficial for us both if he quite literally forgot that I existed. What caught me off guard was the fact that he kept asking me when my birthday was, and what all my mother actually told me. I was quite honestly going to tell him to go screw himself, but he had me curious, so I told him. He paused for a long time before telling me that he would really like to see me for Christmas. It was such a weird and cryptic conversation that I did end up going. I even decided to bring my grandma. She was not happy about going, but she put on her Sunday's best nonetheless and accompanied me to dinner. Our timing was impeccable because by the time we got there, the food was already ready. My mom looked kind of surprised to see my grandma, but in my opinion, she shouldn't have been. Either way, the dinner was so excruciatingly awkward that I ended up spending half the time looking at their tree and wondering if any of the presents under it were for me. But I was quickly snapped out of my thoughts when my mother's husband dismissed the two children from the table and looked my mother in the face just to ask, "Is Janice my daughter?" My grandmother dropped her fork and I nearly choked on my water, but my mother's new husband, we'll call him Brian, didn't even notice because he was so focused on my mom's face. After my grandmother finally regained her composure, she raised a brow in my mother's direction because she, like the rest of us, wanted an answer. I expected my mom to deny it, but instead she looked down at her plate and said, "I don't know." My grandmother was not satisfied with that answer. In fact, she urged my mother to explain herself. But after a few moments of her silence, Brian finally spoke up. According to him, he was aware that my mother was in an abusive relationship. In fact, he was one of the people that urged her to get out of it, not just for her safety, but because he was in love with her. He didn't deny that they were fooling around. But when my mother made it clear that she wasn't interested in leaving the situation she was in, he demanded that she choose him or my father. My mother chose my father, which was the last straw for Brian, and he left. A couple of years passed before he saw her again, and when she ran into him, she made it clear that she no longer had attachments with my father. He didn't even know I existed until last year when my grandmother got in contact with her about me. She told him that my father and her had a baby together and that she revoked her rights and moved on. But when I showed up on the doorstep, he looked into my eyes and saw the eyes of his other two daughters and started to question everything my mother has said so far. Now he wanted to know the truth, and so did the rest of us. When my mother finally spoke up, she explained that she was unsure. She knew that she had been involved with Brian and my father at the same time, but she assumed that I was my father's because she felt the timelines added up, and even went so far as to say that I looked more like my father than Brian, only to see me now and not be sure. Brian was angry, but he was nowhere near as angry as my grandmother. Before anyone could say anything, my grandmother stood up from the table, yelling at my mother, "You mean to tell me that you abandoned this child with my son and you weren't even sure if he was the father?" I can't honestly remember the rest of the argument because I was deep in my own little world. She left me with him, knowing that he was an abuser, and with full knowledge that he may not even be my father, all the while starting a new life with a new man who apparently wasn't new at all. That could have also been my father? Yeah, I was losing it. And everyone's arguing did nothing but make me even more furious. Before I could stop myself, my hand slammed against the table. When I finally fixed myself to speak, I said, I don't care about the circumstances, and I don't care about your arguing. A paternity test needs to be done. When I find out who my father is, I will deal with you then. And I stormed out. My ride home with my grandmother was excruciatingly silent until she finally said, no matter what way these results go, you will always be my granddaughter. And I appreciated her for that. But she and I wasted no time getting the paternity test materials. The hard part was having to contact my dad and tell him everything that happened. You won't believe what he said. When I finally told my dad about the events of our Christmas dinner, he was speechless. I half expected him to say that he knew, then maybe the abuse and neglect would make sense. But instead, he actually started crying and giving me this long-winded speech about how I was the only good thing in this world that he had ever done, and that he was currently in rehab, which is why I hadn't heard from him. I can't lie, I felt all kinds of emotions. But I did ask him if he ever thought at any point that I wasn't his kid, and he said yes. There was a brief moment when I was first born that he thought that I wasn't his, but chalked it up to jitters from being a dad for the first time. Either way, he was more than willing to submit his DNA so that we could find out for good. My grandmother asked Brian the same, and after we submitted the information, it took 2 weeks for us to get the results. When we got them, I immediately called my dad in rehab and said, you are not the father. Somebody call Maury, that is not your baby. I'm just kidding, I didn't say that. But I did confirm his worst fears by letting him know that he was indeed not my father. But then that meant that I had to call Brian next and tell him the results as well. You won't believe how he responded to the news. When I called Brian to let him know that he was my father, he sighed. I mean, like a genuine sigh. And I honestly couldn't tell if he was happy or not. Instead, he flat out asked me if I was okay with him being my father. I told him honestly that I couldn't tell him over the phone. So he invited me once again to come to his house. My grandmother insisted on coming, and I definitely didn't stop her. When we got there, Brian was already waiting outside for us, and as soon as I got out of the car, he hugged me for a long time and then apologized to me for not being active in my life. Now, I won't lie, it wasn't him that I blamed. In fact, I felt like my mother was the catalyst to all of this. When I asked where she was, he informed me that she packed a few of her things and left. He claimed that she felt guilty and didn't know how to face me, so she left to take a little break, which to me just sounded like she was playing the victim in a situation that she created, but that's just my take on it. Either way, Brian invited me to live with him and his 2 daughters. He also asked my grandmother if he could formally adopt me. My grandmother, of course, said the decision was all mine, which I admired her for. I ended up living with my grandmother for 3 more years before transitioning into the home of Brian and his daughters. I won't lie, it's been a very different experience, but I lived with him until I went away to college. I am 21 now, and I'm hoping to add to my family here in the next 4 months. I do still keep in touch with my father that raised me. From the last time we talked, it sounds like he's doing well and has even met someone new that he's sharing his life with. My sisters are in high school, and from what I hear, they're doing great. One of them is in band, the other is pursuing art. We have a pretty good relationship, and I'm hoping to build on it. My grandmother passed away last year, and it was a really hard day for us all, but I genuinely think that she held in there just to see me make it, and I will never forget her for that. As far as my mother, Brian says he keeps in touch with her, but I genuinely think that the day that she left was the day that he kicked her out, but he'll never admit that to me, of course. Either way, according to him, she's doing well on her own. I want to believe that, but right now I have my own family brewing, and all I can do is hope that I'll be half the mother that my grandmother was. Do you think she'll mind if I name my child after her? I guess we'll see. Wish me luck.
My husband cheated on me, and I'm okay with it. On Friday, I, 26 female, caught my husband, 32 male, with his coworker in our bedroom. I didn't feel shocked. I had suspected it for a while, but he waved it away. After the incident, he had been on his best behavior for 4 days and finally wanted to talk to me about it. I told him I was okay with it, and he was shocked. He cried and was angry, asking if I never loved him in the first place because apparently he did.
Story time on how my mom forced me to be a lesbian. Okay, so boom, let's jump right into it. I'm currently 14 years old and being raised by my single mother. My dad wanted nothing to do with me and left my mom since she didn't want to terminate the pregnancy. Also, my mom found out that my dad was cheating on her and gave her an incurable STD. My mom was devastated and grew a hatred for my dad. My mom, of course, put him on child support and made sure she ruined his life. And it honestly worked. My mom gets checks every month as well as never lets my dad even speak to me, which I don't mind because he's kind of an a-hole and he clearly shows that he wished I was never born. Well, once my mom got revenge from my dad, she still really hated him. Like, she despised that man. And she hated my dad so much, she started to grow a hatred for men. My mom currently dates a woman who I love because I basically have two moms. But her hatred for men oozed into my dating life. Like and follow for part 2. Part 2 on how my mom forced me to be a lesbian. Okay, so boom, like I said, because of what my dad did, my mom's hatred for men oozed into my dating life. Watch part 1 to understand. So when I would tell my mom about my crushes on boys, she always seemed so disgusted. And my mom told me I need to try dating girls and not boys because boys are stupid. I even tried bringing a boy over and she yelled at me. But when I bring girls over, she literally doesn't care. I decided to listen to my mom and I experimented. And you know what? I actually fell in love with a girl. But after a year of dating, we had a nasty breakup. I moved on and I met a guy. I found out I don't care about genders and if I like you, I just like you. But I'm definitely bi and not just lesbian. But my mom wants me to erase men from my brain. My mom is hurt by my dad and I understand her, but I just want to be true to who I am. I can't go out with boys, talk to boys, text boys, be on the phone with boys, just nothing. She's literally forcing me to be with and only surrounded by girls. What do I do?
It's time for Cookies and Crime listener stories. This is the Blue Room sent in by Mackenzie. Mackenzie says, "This is a story my dad tells everyone. He calls it his Blue Room story, and it's one of his only ghostly encounters. My dad was 5 and lived in a house in Sheldon, Missouri. The house was right next to a cemetery and funeral home, and when my dad turned 5, his parents decided it was time for him to get his own room in the house. During his first night's stay, he said he saw a blue cloud fill the room until he was so scared he ran to his parents. He never slept in there again, and not too long later, they moved out and a new couple moved in. My dad's grandma still lived in the town, so while he was visiting her in high school, he decided to stop by his old home and ask the couple who had moved in how they liked the place. They told him it was great, but also very haunted, and they offered to give him a ghost tour. He agreed, and as a joke, he wanted to listen to their stories. The wife told him of the time she was dragged out of her bed, and the time she saw a little girl in a nightgown crying on the staircase. She even said that knives had been thrown at her in the kitchen. My dad said that there were holes in the wall where the knives were supposedly thrown, but he assumed what she said was made up. Finally, they got to my dad's room. My dad asked, "This was my room before we moved. Has anything creepy ever happened in here?" The homeowner said, "Yes. In fact, we call this the Blue Room because every so often, a blue fog fills the room and then disappears." My dad said the hairs on his neck immediately shot up. He had never told anyone his story, and there was no way she could have known. He quickly left, and a couple years later, the house burned to the ground with no explanation, as did the cemetery and funeral home next door.